Hi, everyone. Counselor, do you want to get us started before you turn it over to us?
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for participating in this conversation so that we can engage and move forward with this proposal. So please listen and give your input. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. So thanks everyone for joining us. I think possibly this is the 5th of our neighborhood meetings for Missing Middle. And I believe we had the largest registration for tonight. Is that right, Travis? Out of 5 we've had? Yep. So it looks like we're doing pretty good and people are still signing on. So we're real happy about that. I'm going to go ahead and tell you who's on the call from the Tulsa Planning Office. I'm Susan Miller, the director of the Tulsa Planning Office. And presenting tonight will be Travis Hulse, who's you can see on the screen. He's principal planner for Planning and Design Group. From just seeing some of the people that have signed on, I think many of you probably know him. He's been with the city for a bit now, and he managed the housing study most recently. So you may have worked with him in that regard. Nathan Foster, probably a lot of you know him as well. He's a senior planner in current planning, works with us with the Planning Commission and Board of Adjustment and all kinds of things, development review related. Amy is not here. We have a lot of other people from the planning office on the line though. We have JT Paganelli, who's really just kind of helping us with the logistics of the presentation tonight. And I know I've seen, and I think Emily Scott, who is the Vibrant Neighborhood Partnership. She's the program manager for that. And she's on the call too, as well as I saw Louisa Krug on the line. I think Dennis Whitaker's on the line. So we have a lot of us from the planning office. And I saw some other city staff and TVA staff. So we have a lot of people who do a lot of work in the North Tulsa community. So that's who is on the line tonight. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're gonna go through. First, Travis will talk about the housing study, the results of the community surveys, what we heard from those surveys, some of the results, and there'll be some opportunities for polls during this presentation too, just to see how maybe that compares to that. Also, there's a lot of adopted policy on housing, and Travis will talk about in this area what is specific to this area and what policies we have in place. And Travis and Nathan will start talking about missing middle housing, what it is, what we really mean by that, and how we're trying to make that a feasible option in the neighborhoods, especially the near downtown neighborhoods that were subject to the housing study. And then Nathan's going to talk about an overlay to help facilitate that, what that means, what we need to do to get that, and then we'll talk about your questions, what it might mean to you, and see what you might have to say or your input on that. I did want to, this is a interesting process learning about public meetings on Zoom. The first one we had was hacked and it was a little nuts. So our format is a little different than your typical Zoom meeting now. We kind of had to change it out. So I just wanted to go over the process for comments. If we will, as we go through the presentation, if you could put your comments in the question and answer section on the screen. That way, when we get to the end, we can go through those. And we literally do go through the questions in the order that they are submitted and try to answer those. And sometimes, we check it during the presentation too. So sometimes we can integrate those answers into the presentation as well. So if you could use that question and answer function, that would be great. The functionality of this has everyone muted. So when we get to the end of the presentation, if you want to ask a question, not just put it in the question and answer, if you could raise your hand, there's a little hand function, and then we'll know to unmute you. I think that's it. The meeting's scheduled for 2 hours. We will be here, if we don't need 2 hours, we won't be here that long, but we'll be here as long as we need to. So I think I've covered it all. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Travis.
Thanks. good evening, good late afternoon. I don't know what it is, but nice to see everyone. Like Susan mentioned, over the past week or two, meeting with many of the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown as it pertains to the housing study. We've had quite a few different housing conversations during our time in the comprehensive plan back in 2010. Probably more recently, the Unity-Heritage Neighborhoods Plan, which 2016, so still about 4 or 5 years ago now. And I know that's still an ongoing conversation with many of you. And then we've had a couple of surveys go out. So wanted to just briefly ask as we get started here, which of these things, for those of you who have joined us tonight, have you participated in? So JT is going to launch a poll here, and if you wouldn't mind responding to that, we're hoping to see some new faces here in our hopes to reach out and have conversations with as many people as possible. This is kind of another tool. So if you wouldn't mind responding to that and giving us a sense of what you've been involved in, that'll kind of help us as we move through some of these details. So we'll give you, half a minute, 30 seconds, minute. Then we'll kind of see what we have here. We'll share the results so everybody can kind of see, for those who are participating, what everyone has been involved in. Thanks. Okay, great. So yeah, no, it looks like we have about half, I'd say, generally, who have participated in something, half that really haven't participated in some of these different things we're going to talk about tonight. So that's actually really good. We know that not everybody gets a chance to be involved in everything that they'd probably like to. Sometimes it's a challenge, whether it's doing things virtually or some of these other things. So this is a great opportunity to get some more feedback and get input into the specific conversation that we'll focus on tonight. And so I'll jump into that here. A lot of the planning initiatives and different things we've gone through that I just mentioned, we're really going to focus on the housing study primarily tonight and what it focuses for our efforts in talking about housing within your neighborhood specifically. Some of you participated in this based on that poll, but not everyone. So I'm going to just briefly highlight this. It's about a 200, maybe more page document. And we will make that available and everything else that we mention available to you after this meeting. We'll send links to everything so that you can really dive into that, read it as much as you'd like. And if you want to give us a call and talk more about it at that point, we will be to do that. We're going to give you our contact as well here at the end. So we won't be able to cover everything tonight, but the housing study itself, so this was concluded early 2020. It was an update to an effort done back in 2010. You can see in that graphic on the right, that boundary expanded a little bit to include a greater portion of neighborhoods surrounding downtown. 2010, there was really a push for implementation of housing within the IDL downtown. And when we restarted this effort back up in 2020, we really wanted to answer a lot of other questions that exist outside of downtown, including downtown itself still, but knowing that there's definitely a focus in our existing neighborhoods, many of our core neighborhoods that are the identity of Tulsa. And so it was important to start asking questions about those neighborhoods specifically. So things like, where do we see a market demand? What is that gap in our housing demand for Tulsa and within this area specifically? What kind of support, sentiments, good or bad, do we have or hear from both the local development community, but also from residents, from you all that live in these neighborhoods? What benefits or concerns do you have when it comes to housing in general? We're going to be talking about new housing options tonight, but we wanted to ask that question. And we also wanted to, in that whole conversation, understand what barriers exist to all of those things. That's kind of our task as planners, is to understand barriers from all of those perspectives and start to do what we can to implement actions and, start moving forward in ways that we can. So The housing study really set us up for this conversation, and what we'll talk about specifically tonight is just a piece of that, but it gives us a good place to start. And so in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the key kind of findings or conclusions from the housing study, which really was a focus on market demand. It gave us a 10-year projection for housing. So this chart really contains a lot of information. I think what I want to draw your attention to more than anything is how we see that there is a demand across all income levels, affordable, workforce, moderate, all the way up to luxury. Definitely some more than others. So this is based on employment growth. This is based on feasibility. This is based on what do we have today and what do we, see in the future in these next upcoming 10 years. And so it's important, to recognize what that demand looks like so that we can understand the specific strategies moving forward. And as you can tell, there's a greater focus and greater need within those affordable workforce, moderate income levels. So we focused a lot of our during the housing study to think about that and prioritize really within these neighborhoods what we could do and what some of those solutions might look like. Also, as part of the housing study, we asked questions about housing typologies and just what seems right, don't have today, what do we see today, what different options might be available. So we deployed a survey as a part of this effort to ask the question to you all and to citywide. The survey went out. We had, I want to say, around 1,700 people respond, asking the question of these different housing types, what would you be comfortable with? What would you like to see in your neighborhood? These pictures may look similar to many of you, and were included on that survey, but a whole lot of different options. And these aren't all of them, but I think kind of cover a broad range of what could be available. Many of these are examples of what we see in Tulsa, so they probably look pretty familiar to you. So in those survey results, what we saw was really kind of an interest across the board, some more than others. This is citywide, so this is everybody who responded to that survey who lived in Tulsa. There was even a few people who lived outside of Tulsa that responded to this survey. And as you can tell, just generally over 50% of those that participated, we heard there was interest in apartments, detached homes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, maybe not so much for things like high-rise apartments or micro units, which really is a type of kind of higher density apartment development. And, that's helpful for us. We kind of first and foremost need to know what options sit right with folks. We talk about it from a market perspective. It's maybe a little bit of a different question. So we also looked at what we heard really based on the more neighborhood level, what we heard who live within these areas. So next couple of slides, what I'm going to show you is really how that same question breaks down based upon those geographies within the housing study boundary that really closely align with what we're kind of broadly referring to as the Greenwood Unity-Heritage neighborhood. Includes Legacy, the Heights, Crutchfield, Dunbar, Joe Louis. So in this shaded area, this is what we heard. And it's a little bit different. I would say there's even less of an interest in apartments kind of across the board. Duplex, triplex, quadplex were close to 50%, but not quite there. We really don't 50% until we get into the detached homes, townhomes, things like that. So that's important for us to understand. If we're going to talk about implementing and bringing new housing into neighborhoods, again, we want to know really at a neighborhood level for the people who live there, what are you most comfortable with? And this is different than what we heard citywide. The next kind of neighborhood focused breakdown of those survey results, just to show you a little bit how this changes, and it does pull little portions of the Greenwood Unity-Heritage in, but primarily the Pearl District area. Their responses, again, different from citywide, different from that other portion that we just previously showed you. Greater interest in apartments, really, except for those high rise and higher density things. So we're going to talk more about this tonight. We're going to ask this question for those of you who are joining us tonight. Seeing that not everybody got a chance to participate in that survey, this is a great opportunity to really kind of ask that question again. So we're going to ask that here in just a moment. But what I want to kind of focus on for the purpose of our meeting tonight, there was a priority action identified in the housing study that talked about removing barriers to missing middle infill development. So what does that? It's just a lot of words. Missing middle we'll define here in a second, but really it's those housing types that people expressed interest in that we don't really see much of right now in many of these neighborhoods. So your duplexes, your triplexes, even apartments, condos, townhomes, multi-unit homes, those types of housing options that people express some interest in. One of the recommendations from the housing study was to see what barriers they are. You know, is there a reason why we don't have those homes in these neighborhoods today? Is it a market issue? Is it a community support issue? Is it a zoning code issue? So as you can maybe imagine, the reason why we're talking to you is Tulsa Planning Office. The zoning code is really something that we own, we kind of have responsibility over, we oversee, we staff the planning commission. So our job has been looking into the zoning code, those existing regulations, and trying to identify if there are barriers there, while also understanding that there may be barriers from a market perspective, there may be barriers from other perspectives as well. So tonight we'll focus a little bit more specifically on the zoning code challenges that we've identified and talk a little bit about what we believe to be a potential resolution to that specific issue. So we'll get into that here in a second when Nathan talks a little bit more about that. Missing middle, specifically, kind of want to define this here for everyone so you know what that's all about. It's really pretty straightforward. And when you see this graphic, missing middle refers to that housing that I've mentioned already, really what fits in between a detached home and a multifamily apartment complex. The terminology is a little bit different here, what you see on the screen, but generally, you know, missing because it's something we haven't really seen built since mid-century. You know, we really started focusing on detached homes. That was nationwide. That's not unique to Tulsa, but something that's really started to come back and we've started to see more interest in. And then middle because it fits in between really kind of the spectrum of housing. So when we say missing middle, that's what we're talking about. We're kind of broadly referring to all of these different housing types. I wanted to just also touch on the next couple of slides in survey that we did more recently, where we reached out asking questions about housing in neighborhoods. One of the things that we asked really kind of focused on the topic of adding new housing to existing neighborhoods. This can be a challenge for different reasons. So we wanted to kind of understand what those reasons are, both what benefits look like as well as concerns. So in a separate survey, we love to survey, love to ask people to tell us how they feel about these issues. We asked this question about beneficial aspects of new housing in existing neighborhoods. I wanted to know what people thought made the most sense. So citywide, these responses are showing you kind of that breakdown. For the responses in the light blue, dark blue, that's really where you have kind of, yeah, we agree, there's some benefit here. Orange, red, you know, maybe not so much is seen as a benefit. So next slide, I'm just going to highlight kind of the top 3 benefits that we've heard through that effort. This graphic isn't great, and I apologize, but if you kind of see there, Tulsa, the word Tulsa, underneath it is kind of your core downtown, and in and around there is the neighborhood areas that were identified in the housing study. So far and wide, most people agreed that the three top benefits, one dealing with efficiency of utilizing existing infrastructure, another was just expanding choices, different families, different lifestyles, different preferences. Expanding choices can be a great boon to neighborhood stability, allowing for people to age in place who want to raise a family there, but also live there when they retire. If you only have a single housing option, then that can be a challenge. So that was identified as a benefit. And then greater affordability, and that's kind of an interesting point. But one of the things that you do see in various housing options when you have a diversity of housing is that you do have different levels of affordability. What it costs to rent or own can be both. So if you have all detached homes, then really it's kind of a set market, so to speak. But when you start offering other options, it can really open up that affordability, which, as we mentioned earlier, is an important piece of this conversation. So Susan mentioned, we've been having these conversations previously. We have some housing policy that's been on the books, if you will. So I'm just showing here one of those plans, Unity-Heritage Neighborhood Plan from 2016. There was a couple of goals identified in that plan that talked about some of these same ideas and concepts. One of the goals for a variety of housing, whether that be for family, professionals, seniors, kind of mentioned that. So it looks like there was some, similar about that. And then down at 3.3, where there's a mention about special zoning overlays for higher density residential, that actually fits in really well with our conversation tonight. We're going to talk about that, specifically. But so we've kind of heard some of these same ideas, same concepts from from people who've lived in these neighborhoods over time. I also want to mention the comprehensive plan. It also identified similar goals, and that's, citywide. You can see there was a couple of goals that really just identified robust mix of housing types, and also, again, focusing on low income workforce affordable housing. So we've had housing policy that's really been there telling us this is important. We need to do something about this. So from that, and from our conversations during the housing study, and from our housing surveys, all of these conversations are kind of coming together to move us into action. Nathan's going to spend the next little while talking about what we believe is one solution to barriers that we've identified in the zoning code that could really open up opportunities to allowing different housing types within existing neighborhoods. And our conversation tonight is not only to really kind of just bring everybody into this and explain a little bit and present a little bit, but we want to have a conversation with you. We want to hear what concerns you have, what questions you have, what do we need to clarify, what does this mean? So as we continue to talk, and as Nathan presents this next piece, go ahead and start dropping any thoughts or comments or questions into that Q&A box. And then when we get to the end, we'll spend the rest of the time talking with you about that.
Well, thanks, Travis, and good evening, everybody. So I was going to talk a little bit about the overlay that's been mentioned several times and has appeared in many recommendations throughout the years as we've done planning efforts in a lot of these neighborhoods. As the zoning works today in most of the city of Tulsa, there's a applied standard-based zoning that would exist on your property, and in neighborhoods most of the time that are just single-family homes, that's exactly what the zoning allows for. While some other areas do have more of a mix of uses like multifamily or even then we get into commercial and industrial districts. So at the moment, a lot of those neighborhoods are pretty much exclusively zoned for single family residential homes. And so when we started looking at the recommendations of not only the housing study, but the previous planning efforts and the multiple calls to see a mixture of housing found in some of these near downtown neighborhoods, it made us think about our zoning regulations differently and try to understand what we could do in these areas to essentially remove some of the existing barriers to implementing those types of uses that exist today and that might deter someone from being able to to develop something on a smaller scale, but maybe not just a single family home. So in 2015, we worked through a new zoning ordinance, and it was adopted early 2016. And it included this overlay tool, which allows us to essentially define a geography in the city and set new zoning standards for that area that can either remove some restrictions or even tighten some restrictions to make sure that we're accomplishing some of these planning goals that we have. So in doing that, we can really work to eliminate uses that may not be appropriate while allowing some that could exist appropriately within neighborhoods. But we can also do it in a controlled way where we can apply additional rules to how those things can look and how they can be developed in neighborhoods. And so when looking at these recommendations, it really became clear that the overlay would be an opportunity for us to go in and really adjust these rules in these neighborhoods without having to fully rezone anyone's property, but instead by using more of a broad brush approach to allow these things that we know are wanted or in demand. So in the next slide, what we've done is really start to define those use or those restrictions that exist today in the zoning code, use being the first one. So anytime someone proposes to build something in the city of Tulsa, their first step is going to be looking at zoning and trying to understand what is allowed to be constructed on that lot. And our zoning code classifies a whole range of use types, but when it comes to residential, it really classifies everything by a building type. So each of the building types that we've referred to in the survey and in previous plan documents, we went through and we tried to find where those were defined in our zoning code, and we wanted to know where they were allowed, where there were barriers, and what we could do to address those. Beyond just the use of the lots, there's also issues regarding how much lot area might be required to support certain uses, including lot widths. And that really is due to the fact that a lot of the neighborhoods in these areas were platted well before the zoning code that is in place today was ever contemplated. And so a lot of the plats were done with lots that don't even conform to the zoning districts that they're in today. So that also means some of the uses that exist today. I know we mentioned earlier that some of these uses already exist in Tulsa, and you may have examples even in your neighborhood of duplexes or fourplexes that were built long ago. As it stands today, if those are zoned in those single family neighborhoods, they face a lot of challenges if they ever want to make improvements or come in and restore that building, specifically due to the fact that they can't meet the code requirements of today. And so we want to try to address some of those barriers as well on nonconformities and make sure that if there are buildings that are useful and that could be brought back to life and contribute to a neighborhood, that we're not going to stand in the way of someone doing that and cost them extra time and extra steps before they'd be able to get there. The final thing that we really know is a barrier to development on some smaller residential lots is the concept of parking and how much minimum parking is required for these uses. So there's a lot of discussion around the idea about the BRT and new transit options, really reducing the amount of cars that people are in need of or that are being used, as well as just demographic factors that say oftentimes people don't have cars or they don't need them anymore. So a lot of times our code over requires parking based on what might actually be needed for a building or a development in a neighborhood. And so that often leads to just extra concrete that could be either green space or landscaping. It also leads to issues with runoff because you lose a lot of your impervious surface. And so looking at ways we might be able to reduce those minimum parking requirements to open up some more options as well. So in the next few slides, what I'm going to do is talk specifically about those building types that we've mentioned before. And I want to talk to them regarding how they're classified in our zoning code. So a townhouse is pretty straightforward. That's a single unit on a single lot. However, they do share a common wall, and they can be developed in 2 units. So it could just be 2 units attached to one another, or they can be a row of townhomes that exceeds 3 units and more. Oftentimes, townhouses open up opportunities for lower maintenance costs because the yards are obviously almost non-existent in some cases. They also allow for more units on an area that may not provide as much density if it were just developed as single family detached homes. And so they become a pretty good option, and they're a pretty good transition from maybe what would be a typical single detached family home versus having these townhomes as a possibility. On the next slide, we talk about the concept of duplexes. So this is one that is really very present in the city of Tulsa. There's a lot of duplexes out there, and it's very simple. It's 2 units on one lot versus being restricted to that individual unit. And This is often one of those more affordable options that may exist within a neighborhood where single family homes that rent much higher, you could get a better cost on something like a duplex where even an owner could live in one unit and rent out the other, or they could rent out both units. This just provides that versatility of options. And in the next few slides, I think we have some examples of in Tulsa where duplexes are existing today. So these are just some renderings that Daniel in our office has put together to show where some existing duplexes have fit in with single family neighborhood contexts. So the structure in the middle that's being shown here from different perspectives is a duplex that's tucked in between two existing single family homes. Our code regulates the duplex within the same building envelope as what a single family home would be allowed to be in. So oftentimes it would meet the same exact building standard, but it would just offer 2 units in place of just a single unit like a detached house would. This is just a few different perspectives to show that same building mass on that street front. And this is a 1 level versus the 2 level you saw before. So this is another duplex that fits just between 2 single family homes and really maintains the same character while offering that versatility of housing options. So another classification in our code is a cottage house development. And I think on the slide Travis showed earlier with missing middle defined, these were looked at as bungalow courts, and they're called lots of different things. But the idea is that you develop a single family detached home village almost around a common open space rather than your typical street fronting homes. And this allows for more of a neighborhood feel. It also often allows for smaller detached homes to be developed on lots where maybe a larger home would only be able to be built before. And so it does give you a diversity of option, but it also gives you a different type of neighborhood feel and really adds some activity and gives some different options for people when they're looking at housing types. I think the next slide is going to cover, so multi-unit houses it's similar to a duplex, but it ups the units from just 2 to allowing up to 4 units in a single structure on one lot. These are also present here in Tulsa. There's a picture of one on the screen that's located in the Swan Lake neighborhood at 17th and Quincy. Our code looks at a multi-unit house and really tries to create something that matches the form and character of just a single family home. It requires that the building has a single street fronting entrance that shares access to all the units versus having, different units on different sides of the building with different entrances. This basically contains everything on that street front side and helps to maintain a really similar character to what you might see otherwise in the neighborhood while adding additional units. I think we have some, so we're going straight into apartments is the final classification in our zoning code. Currently, our code requires apartments to meet certain area requirements to essentially increase how many units may be available on the lot. Sometimes that's pretty prohibitive and doesn't allow for a lot of density to be added to an apartment complex. But the good news is that specific regulation is what would help us if we were to allow apartments in certain neighborhoods to make sure that the size of those buildings are controlled or that the amount of units that may be allowed in those would be more controlled. This slide says that the overlay would allow for a maximum of 12 units. That's really just a concept. It's not something that's set in stone. So as we talk with neighborhoods and we gain more feedback about preference and what might be appropriate, that number is definitely subject to change and can be tweaked, as well as just the idea of all of these uses are kind of on the table for us to discuss and understand if they would be acceptable and if people would want them in their neighborhood. We have a few more, I believe, models here of triplexes, and this would be classified as an apartment, unlike the multi-unit house, because of the way the entrances to these units are done. So you've got an entrance on each end of the building as well as one in the center. So that's 3 units in one building. I think as you click through these, JT, it's just a few different examples of that triplex. And then there's also a quadplex shown, or maybe I think it's a sixplex. I always make that mistake. Yeah, so this is a 6-unit apartment building that's located on Quaker in a single family, primarily neighborhood, but with some variety here and there of these buildings that were built probably in the very early 1900s. But this particular building has 6 units. It has a single entrance and allows entry from inside. And as you can see, it really doesn't grow out of scale with the neighborhood in any way. It fits in nicely, and it does provide that ability for a variety of housing types. So getting back to the original question that Travis had asked, and now that we've given you a little bit more insight on each of these different types of uses, what we wanted to do was ask the same question again, and this time ask it of you all who are here and who are participating today. So JT is going to launch a poll that gives you this question about which of the following housing options would you support being built in your neighborhood. We'd like you to select any of those that you think you would support or be in favor of. We did take apartments and create tiers so that you could kind of indicate a preference on how many units you think might be appropriate, if any at all. And then you also have the option to say just none of the above. So we'll give you just a little while to answer that poll question, and then we'll share the results and kind of just talk about what we see. For those of you who have already answered and are also just waiting again, feel free to, if you have come up with any questions, to use the Q&A bar at the bottom. And it looks like a few have been submitted. So yeah, go ahead. And I've got one more slide after this, and then we're going to be jumping into some Q&A. All right. It's like 20 people got in some responses here. Not surprisingly, it looks like it kind of lines up with the results that Travis shared earlier in terms of preference. There was a little more support here, I think, for some of the apartment units. It looks like 6 units and 8 units seem to be a more preferable number for those that thought they would support that. But duplexes and triplexes really were highly supported. That kind of idea, I think, probably of inserting those uses is a little bit more favorable, or can be perceived to be more favorable in a neighborhood that's primarily single family homes. So thanks. Yeah, we really appreciate you guys giving us that feedback. And we're going to take all this, obviously, as we continue to work through this process and use that feedback to make sure that what we present to the neighborhoods is in line with what we've heard from you all. So we appreciate that. So on the next slide, I'm just going to cover really what the process of an overlay would look like. There's some months listed on the screen, but I don't want you guys to think we're off and running immediately. We do want to give you guys just a time frame of what a process for this looks like. So the overlay has to first be put into our zoning code as text. So whatever those regulations are that we want to adopt, we have to draft and put them into the zoning code so that they can then be applied to properties. So the first step for any overlay adoption would be a proposal of that draft and what those text amendments would look like. The steps that would go through would start with a planning commission work session. And that really is just a conversation between staff and planning commissioners about the concepts presented to them and any questions they have before we actually move up to a public hearing where we'll put the draft out and make it public. People will be able to make comments and attend that hearing and weigh in if there's things that they think we should have included or shouldn't have, before finally they make a recommendation and send that on to City Council to make a final decision on the adoption of that ordinance. Once the text is adopted and it's in the zoning code, that's when a map amendment would need to be initiated before that zoning was effective anywhere. So the boundaries that we showed earlier are the initial boundaries that we're working off of and that we're going to continue to manipulate as we work through these meetings and try to understand what's appropriate. So once we begin that process of initiating a map amendment, there would be another round of public engagement with those property owners that would be impacted by the change. We would have probably very similar meetings to this where people could come in, hear about what we're proposing, ask questions before moving it through the exact same process really that the text amendments went through, which would be a work session with the Planning Commission followed by a hearing and their recommendation before a final decision before the City Council. So lots of different opportunities for you all to remain engaged in this process as we move forward. And there would be a lot more chances for us to share those details with you all as they're more fine-tuned and as we hear more from you guys. So we've shared some links on the screen as well so that you guys can keep in touch with us and see what's going on with our office. That's where we will share all of our information on our Facebook and all of the events that we've got planned, including some more events even throughout this month for the Planuary event we're currently taking on. So those are things that are important to you, and we'll provide you guys with this slide that also has all those links, so you'll have those shortly after this. So with that, I'm going to move into our Q&A slide, and I'll ask my friends to join me back so we can begin responding to some of the questions that have been submitted. We also added some questions to this slide so that you guys can be prompted if you'd like to give us some responses in the chat box. or if those prompt other questions from you all, then feel free to go ahead and submit those to us as well. So with that, I think I will get into the Q&A here. Looks like Danny has the first question. Many of the neighborhoods adjacent to the IDL downtown area are also historic overlay districts. Has there been connection, conversation, understanding, education with the Historic Preservation Commission? One of the additional barriers to a middle housing infill effort is the Historic Commission's requirements for grossly more expensive materials and foundations. Is there a balance between respecting the historic homes and additional to the missing middle housing? If the construction costs are higher in historic districts, this will defeat a rental rate or purchase rate. So the historic preservation overlays would remain in place, and their restrictions that are more strict would definitely, I guess, they would supersede anything that the overlay did. That's part of the adoption of that preservation overlay, is that it is subjected to the Preservation Commission's process. I think if we were to propose an overlay in those districts, we would definitely have more conversations with the historic preservation officer who's in our office to ensure that we could make it work and ensure that we're not doing anything that would create issues in those areas. But they would not overrule any of those historic preservation guidelines that are already in effect.
I think the only historic preservation neighborhood in this batch of neighborhoods, though, around downtown is the Heights.
Yeah, and the boundaries that we're talking about, I think you're right. That's currently the only active HP. Thomas, you have a question. Are there any safety concerns for apartments with a common street front entrance and a separate inside access? It's not something that we've heard initially, and we know that these types of apartment buildings do already exist in a lot of these neighborhoods. So I think that it can be done appropriately, and I'm sure that there's lighting and design improvements that could be done to ensure that safety component is there. But initially, that wasn't something that was brought up as a concern.
So next question, kind of a comment, and I'll just mention it here, is that just support for kind of what we're hearing tonight, but that there is a concern about affordability and ensuring taxes remain reasonable. I don't have my video on, looking at the black void, sorry. But want to make sure taxes remain reasonable because we do not want to be ran out of our neighborhoods. Yeah, and that conversation is something that came up a lot, especially during the housing study. As we were going through that, talking about, bringing in investment and new housing and all these different things. And so I think just to agree with the comment, as far as maintaining that perspective, that there's a priority in making sure that we may continue to offer different options and maintain affordability for those people who are living there now today, and not just talking about new people, new housing, new development. I mean, a lot of the things that the housing study contemplates, and I won't get into all of the details of it, but talks about, just renovation, repair, other things outside of building, new builds, where there may be opportunities for homes that are, maintenance is deferred or whatever, that there are also opportunities there. So yeah, just an agreement with that comment. That is something that is going to be extremely important, and is kind of that other aspect of the market side of things. What we're looking at is really kind of zoning, but as we continue to have conversations, that is definitely a part of what we're hearing, and we'll continue to keep in mind as we move forward.
One thing I want to mention just on that same note, Travis, is like you mentioned, we're looking really at zoning now, and we are very aware there's going to be a lot of other things we need to understand and kind of address as barriers to this that were also recommendations in that housing study. So this is certainly not the only implementation step that will be taken as a part of that. And I think even Cayenne has dropped a few comments in the chat box to share some of the other tools that may be available to address some of the affordability issues, as well as some of those needs for help investments and things like that. So just some things to note is that this zoning is very clearly just one part of it, and we want to stay in tune to what those other concerns are as well.
Man, I'm glad Cayenne's here.
On Joyce's question that's here in the box, was there a defined square footage in the housing study for how we said large, medium versus small?
Yeah, so I was looking at that. Not by square footage. And if the question is about the housing study, I'll just tell you that when that question was posed, small detached house was defined as 2-bedroom, 1 bath. There wasn't a specific square footage put in there. Mid-size was 3-bedroom, 2 bath. And then a large detached house was 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. So as far as how those were defined, just specific to the housing study, that's how those were called out. So,
Bill, you have a question here. Has there been a study on zoning as it relates to an increase or decrease of property values? It's a very, very good question. There hasn't been something done like that locally, so there's not something I can reference there. But we did talk even with Councilor Harper about this very issue in advance of this effort, and wanting to make sure that we understand and are aware of any of those implications that may exist as these changes move forward. There's not anything that we're aware of at this moment that it would have an immediate impact on those, but we do want to make sure we're not going to cause any issues when it comes to property values and how that assessment of properties is done. So we've committed to learn more about that process and how that works, and try to ensure that we're doing all we can to make sure we reduce that impact.
Yeah, and another comment just about seniors specifically in these neighborhoods and wanting to prioritize, opportunities for them to continue to live in neighborhoods as people age. I think that that's something that through offering or through opening up opportunities for additional housing, which is really what the overlay and what we're talking about from a zoning perspective anyways, I think will make that much more likely or much more achievable, where you can have different housing types. It's challenging if you have, again, I think right now lots of detached homes, maybe not as easy of something to for seniors to, I keep trying to stay away from the term age in place because it's not, but what you're talking about. So
I think there's definitely a trend, Travis, of elderly wanting homes that come with lower maintenance costs because less space to maintain. And a lot of times detached houses come with all of that because they have the yard, they have the driveway, they have all the extra cost. And so some of that variety of housing often reduces that and helps to create those affordable places where someone could still live independently, but have that network of a community around them that's helpful.
Yeah, and something that goes along with that hasn't come up yet, but has come up in some of our other neighborhood conversations, has been about things like accessory dwelling units. Nathan could maybe talk a little bit about that, but that would be, something else that kind of provides for that as well, seniors specifically.
Yeah, we've recently made some adjustments to our zoning code that had previously pretty much just restricted anyone from building out garage apartments or accessory dwelling units in the neighborhoods. And we adjusted that to where now those can be constructed in conjunction with single family homes by a special exception in single family neighborhoods, but by right in some of the multifamily neighborhoods. So that does open some more options even for a house that's on a lot by itself to potentially add that smaller unit in the back and create those options for maybe elderly family members or even just to create more affordable housing.
The rest of our panelists, it looks like we have a hand raised. Get that going.
Go for it. Yep.
Hello, is this for Tracy?
Hi, Tracy.
Hey, I just wanted you to, I didn't get a chance to get down those, the housing size, you know, with the bathrooms and bedrooms.
Oh, yeah.
That, if you don't mind.
Sorry, did you say you want me to just repeat that?
Yeah, it was talking about, like the smaller units had the one bedroom, the, you know, how many bedrooms and one bath, and then the other units, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, sure. And I think Berlinda's in here. She may disagree with these definitions, so take this with a grain of salt. But for the housing study, a small detached house was 2 bedroom, 1 bath, and then mid-sized 3 bedroom, 2 bath, and then large was 3 bedroom, 2.5 bath. And Tracy, the housing study, which again we'll send you a link, and everyone else outlines all of that. I'm actually just reading that off of my screen, so that's all broken down in more detail as well, if you're interested in looking at that a little bit closer.
I got it. Thank you.
Sure.
There's some conversation in the chat about historic, I turned it off now, but historic designation in Greenwood. And so we're really, when I mentioned the Heights, that's really the only, in the study area, the near downtown housing study area, that's the only residential neighborhood that has a historic preservation zoning overlay. That's different from a National Register designation. That is not tied to zoning. So I know that Greenwood there's a couple of different initiatives there to submit nominations for the National Register nomination. There's also some buildings, some properties in the area that are already designated with the National Register designation. So those two things are different. We're really talking about zoning. The National Register doesn't have an impact on that.
Right now, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. I'm not in any rush to get out of here. So please keep throwing some things in there if you have anything you want to talk a little bit about. But some of the questions here, when we get there, kind of, I don't know, just give you a few things to talk about. We're certainly not at the end of this. As we've been developing the overlay, the specifics of the overlay, these are the kind of concepts and ideas that we feel like make the most sense just based on kind of the information that we presented, the housing study, the surveys, conversations, things like that. But I think one of the things that we've taken away from our conversations meeting with the different neighborhoods is that we have different perspectives. And I think we want to respect that to the best of our ability, and the way that that's reflected in this overlay. So your input is extremely helpful for us understanding for this area, what those perspectives and opinions as far as new housing and just all these things look like. So we appreciate that. Okay, looks like we got another question. Okay, I'm trying to kind of think through this a little bit, but the question is, how does the concept of affordable housing and maintaining a certain property tax level provide for a diversity of amenities, upgrade of schools and libraries, and attract more professionals into the area? So maybe just more from a diversity of housing, diversity of housing options. I think you see, a broad range of things. Nathan alluded to this a little bit with a detached home. You're typically looking at, a lot that individual private property owner is utilizing for their purposes, maintaining and other things. The townhome example, probably don't see that as much. There's more maybe of a common area. Same with the cottage house developments. So I think just the design and the overall design of some of the diversity of housing, I think opens up and attracts different lifestyles and different, whether that be professionals, whether that be seniors, young families, all of those differences. And that's generally kind of what we've heard. As far as, how does that maintain certain property tax level? That's a little outside of, my understanding of all of the issues. So I can't speak too much of that, but I think what we're really looking at in this is opening up options, and diversity of housing really opens the door for all of those different things that we're talking about.
So the next question says, is there a way to tie tax incentives or breaks into zoning or overlays in order to help increase new housing stock? So not into the zoning code. The zoning code does not, there's no monetary ties there. It's really strictly a land regulation ordinance. But saying that, a program could be structured, and we have something sort of similar now with the mixed use zoning and uses along the BRT corridor. There are incentives through the commercial revitalization strategy, is that what it's called, through the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, that are tied to those types of properties. So it could have there could be a partner to those regulations for these types of housing, but not in the zoning code itself. But there could be something structured if that was available and able to be used for something like that.
Yeah, a couple of other things I think were mentioned in the chat already. And I don't know if you said this, Susan, but the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is another, as well as the Mohawk Tax Increment Finance District. And Cayenne could explain more of those details. But so I think, there's definitely some alignment with some of those other tools that could be available in some of these neighborhoods that won't be specifically tied to, like Susan said, the zoning or this overlay, but very much interested in the same kind of geographic areas having that impact.
Ashley had a question about the overlay restricting height and styles. The overlay is pretty versatile in the way that it can be applied to a neighborhood. And so height is a restriction that exists in the zoning today. Most neighborhoods are restricted to a 35-foot height maximum. We hadn't really discussed adjusting that any taller for sure. But height can also be controlled by a lot of other issues, like how many units have to be provided for parking and how much of the setbacks will play into that. So for the most part right now, we've left the height alone at whatever the current maximum height allowed in the neighborhood is, but it could certainly be a component of the overlay.
Couple questions in the chat as well as the Q&A, which is fine. It's okay if you type your questions in the chat too. Nathan talked a little bit about, so the question is, when will we engage the community again? And also just the slide deck being available. Yeah, the slide deck as well as a recording of this conversation will be available tomorrow. We'll send that out, and as well as all of the studies and plans and things that we've mentioned, we'll try to link those as well to make that available. We'll be kind of working on next steps as far as what that looks like, engaging with the community. I think based upon feedback that we hear tonight, which is really just specific to the Greenwood Unity-Heritage neighborhood area, we're also, going to go back and look at those conversations, what we've heard from the different areas, and see what we, feel like makes sense. Is it one overlay that has the same rules that apply throughout that entire boundary area of what we've showed is kind of the housing study boundary? Or is it different? Does that look a little bit different? I would anticipate having some more conversations about that. So we'll make sure to make known through our Facebook, reaching out through Counselor Hall Harper, and making available those opportunities once we know more what that looks like and dates and times. If there's a better way to reach people, we're trying to do our best in our current environment. So we're relying heavily on social media, and appreciate Councilor Hall Harper spreading the word as well there. So we'll let you know. Stay tuned.
So I will attempt to answer Berlinda's questions. I'm not really sure I understand the questions, so let me kind of respond to what I think it is asking. So she's asking, what are the drivers for the different perspectives in different neighborhoods around the benefits or deficits of missing middle housing options? If unknown, what are the specific objections and or supporting arguments that you've heard in the recent listening sessions? So I know, and Travis could speak more specifically and clearly about the housing study and the recommendations in the housing study for these neighborhoods for missing middle housing. It would, as far as just the benefits of missing middle housing in these neighborhoods, there are a lot of benefits. A lot of time it aligns with some of the existing housing stock, provides more affordable options in the neighborhood, provides options for people to age in place. Missing middle offers a lot of different opportunities. I'm not sure which ones the housing study specifically lined out, but I will say, as far as the other neighborhoods that we've talked to, that I don't know that we've heard objections so much, but it was interesting that we have had a very consistent response generally about wanting a lesser amount of units for the multi-unit structure. We were thinking a maximum of 12, and we've heard more a 6 and 8. And I think the poll tonight even showed that, right? I think it showed 6 and 8 were the most popular choices. So that's something that really makes sense for single family neighborhoods. So we've heard that. Let me see. And let me go ahead and then we can see if anyone else, Travis or Nathan, want to add to this. So Berlinda also asked, will overlays also incorporate an architectural style guide for new construction? So no, this really isn't about the style, or there won't be any design guidelines. This just allows these in the overlay specifically. The main thing is to allow these types of missing middle units by right in zoning districts, as opposed to having to go to the Board of Adjustment. Also adjust some of the lot standards that makes them more feasible in these neighborhoods, and with some of the existing lot sizes in specifically these neighborhoods that are near downtown, that are smaller than you would see as you get further out from the center of the city. So there's a lot kind of in all that. So if Nathan or Travis want to add anything to that.
One thing I'll say just on the style guide question is, while we weren't talking about incorporating like very specific design recommendations, there were discussions in some of the other meetings about building placement standards, at least, because that is something that we've controlled previously in the zoning code. So ensuring that buildings aren't placed, behind parking lots or at the back of the lot versus pulled up to the street where there's more of an active streetscape. That's something that could definitely be incorporated and even mimicked out of some of the existing zoning districts we have today. That uses what's called a build-to zone to essentially ensure that the building's close to the street and it's not going to be, a 6 parking spot lane and then a building pushed all the way back to the back. So while we're not talking about specific design requirements, there are some placement standards that I think would help address some of those things that have concerned neighborhoods about these uses in the past, while also making sure we're not using too heavy of a hand and creating something that's going to be not affordable once it's met those standards.
So the question about, there's a question about plan to eliminate the saturation of multifamily dwelling, what is commonly referred to as the projects. In the past, for example, Seminole Hills, or other examples located within or near Unity-Heritage communities. So I just pulled up Seminole Hills and I maybe lost it, but it looked like Seminole Hills was somewhere around 145 units. So I think what we're talking about is just a much different scale, much smaller scale, from the perspective of, if you're thinking 6 units, 6, 8 units, really a lot of times those won't look too much different from some of your larger homes. And it's all context within the neighborhood and within the lot that you're kind of designing and things like that. But most of the zoning regulations in place that restrict height and setbacks and open space requirements and lots of other things will help to control for that. Now, there's not anything presently in the overlay to prevent how many of those, of any of them, whether it's duplexes or detached homes or townhomes. There's nothing really saying you can only have so many of each kind, or within such a distance, things like that. But I think generally speaking, Seminole Hills is kind of that large scale multifamily type complex that we really don't see any support for in our conversations, as well as the surveys and things. So wouldn't be anything reflected in the overlay.
Craig asked, what would you say is an average or typical width in the near downtown neighborhoods? I think we've landed on 50-foot lots being pretty much the standard around some of the downtown area. Your general 7,000 square foot lot was platted mostly very early 1900s. So I would say that's about an average. There's certainly some that fall under 50 feet, and there's some outliers in there that are larger. Bill, sidewalks are a requirement by ordinance with new construction, but there is a fee in lieu that has been adopted by the city of Tulsa. The fee can't be paid if there's an existing sidewalk network that is already there and has to be connected to. It can only be paid when there are no existing sidewalks. And once that money is collected, it's tied to a geographic area for where it was collected, so that we can go back and allocate those funds to hopefully incorporating meaningful sidewalk networks into those neighborhoods.
Well, great questions. We've kind of hit the end again. So if you have some more, if there's anything we haven't articulated well, see, I start talking and they just start popping up again, which is good. Keep them coming. Franchell has a question about, we all kind of recognize there's a need for affordable housing in the city. Will there be monitoring in place at the city level to manage the percentage of affordability in any one district? Wanting to understand that poverty won't be concentrated in any one district. So, Franchell, I don't know the specifics of the affordable housing strategy that's separate from the housing study we're talking about. So probably gets a little confusing. But I think we can point you to probably Kristen Mon at this city, who's really leading that effort now for affordability kind of citywide. And she could help answer that question. I'm not sure what all she is included or what all is included in that plan as far as managing or monitoring or those things that you mentioned. So I can get you her contact information if that's okay.
Joyce, questions related to how can these dwellings come into the criteria of the new plan at Tulsa that you describe as well, and the shotgun houses that pepper the community? So regarding Plan at Tulsa and the update with the comprehensive plan, really that is going to be a reflection of a lot of the planning efforts that have already gone on. I think we're going to continue conversations with neighborhoods as we go through this update, and we anticipate we will hear a lot of the things that we've heard recently in these surveys and in the housing study about some of the areas that we're discussing. So hopefully we'll find that some of the policies coming out of that update will just be supportive of this same concept as it's been kind of communicated over the years and desired. So hopefully that helps. And then shotgun houses that pepper the community, I'm not 100% sure how to address that part of the question. Maybe I don't know if any of you guys have an idea of how that one, with regards to any already in place, maybe there's not any issues there that we would be, there would be no implication if you already had a home in the neighborhood. The overlay is not going to impact that. But if you want to you can send us a chat or raise your hand and if you want to talk more about that particular point. Susan's queued up on this one.
Okay, so this is a Orlando one again. So is the missing middle overlay contemplated as being the same citywide? And how much might the overlay be tailored to a specific district? So for the first question, an overlay is only going to be applied or would only be applied to a smaller geographic area, one of these 5 neighborhood areas that we're talking to the past couple of weeks, not citywide. Citywide, though, we are looking. There are, even though citywide wasn't subject to the missing middle study and didn't have that sort of deeper look at that missing middle housing and why it would be important there. There are some just basic zoning standards that need some adjusting citywide to help facilitate. For instance, duplexes. Right now, the lot width, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's ridiculous.
It's 75 feet.
How much is it?
75 feet.
75 feet.
And a 9,000 square foot lot.
Oh yeah, 9,000 square foot lot. So that's not really doable for the most part. So that's an example of a citywide regulation. So it's not an overlay, it's just a change to the zoning code that would apply everywhere. And how much we've talked about this as far as the overlays tailored to those specific neighborhoods. We've really looked at some really a sort of a base of what we think is the starting point for an overlay, and what we hear, and given the specifics of the neighborhood and what we hear from people that are living in the neighborhood, we can tailor it based on that. I mean, we could have even 5 different overlays, or at least some variations of regulations for the 5 different neighborhoods. That's totally something we could do if that was how it turned out that the neighbors were wanting that. So yeah, they can be customized for sure.
Tracy had a question about sidewalks. Will there be sidewalks on both sides of the street? That is really based on kind of how the sidewalk construction is being funded. The city does have adopted complete streets policies that intend to always install sidewalks on both sides of the street. However, often there's funding awarded through grant programs or otherwise that covers a certain level of sidewalks, at which point they'll just develop a network through that neighborhood. In an instance where new development's occurring, it's just required on the lot with that new development. So those sidewalks would be replaced or rehabbed on a site where a construction project happened. Joyce clarified that the shotgun houses were 3-room houses built in the 40s. And really, that goes back, I was just mentioning that if the overlay were to be adopted, there would not be any impact on those existing homes. They would be able to remain as they are and would be able to be rehabbed and rebuilt even.
We've got a question about just staying up to date for continual kind of information, probably on this and other things. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat either how to sign up for probably the newsletter, but in addition to that, for specific conversation, we have everybody's email just from who registered on these meetings, so I think we'll use that. So we should have your email to be able to communicate in the future.
Franchel asked, will the overlay include opportunities for neighborhoods to have accessory commercial units? There's nothing currently proposed. This is really only related to the residential types that we've discussed today. I will say that as a home occupation, there's allowances for certain uses through the zoning code, through a special exception that gives you those opportunities if you were wanting to do something in your house, just accessory in your unit. But as far as having like commercial businesses in neighborhoods, that's typically going to be fairly restricted. You can certainly always email our office if you've got more questions about how that might look or how that works. And we do have another slide. If you want to share that one with our contact information again, JT, that might help if anyone has some outstanding questions moving forward. This is all of us who've been involved today except for Amy, so I think we should all just email Amy. But if you want to, elaborate on anything or follow up with any of the questions that we've had, feel free to take this down as well. And obviously still feel free to submit more questions to us now. But that was just an option for you guys. I know I've sent my email to a few people in the chat just to get them some information about specific projects and things that they're currently looking at.
Yeah, great question. So there's a question about examples of cities where missing middle housing has worked harmoniously within established historic neighborhoods. So help me out here, others on the panel. I think nationwide there's lots and lots of examples. Chattanooga, Tennessee comes to mind. There's places all over in Portland that come to mind.
I think, most major urban areas, you can see those areas where these types of uses mix, but even as local as here at home, where they're currently already mixed into neighborhoods like Swan Lake, for example, is a really good one, I think, where you can drive through and see where there's sixplexes, even some eightplexes, there's townhomes, there's single family homes that are probably more on the luxury side of the spectrum. So it exists as close as home to here, and we're hoping to try and build on that and make sure that it can continue.
Yeah, and we got a comment as well. A couple of other places, if you care to probably just type in Google missing middle, Denver, Dallas, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and then I mentioned Chattanooga. But yeah, probably most major metropolitan cities have already started to tackle this in some way and found success in doing that. So some examples for you to look up. Well, I'm going to start talking again, so we all know what's going to happen. We've got about 25 minutes left or so. We're happy to be here and continue talking about whatever. If you feel like you've kind of gotten your fill, you've gotten your answers to questions that you've had, feel free to jump off. I don't think we'll have any new information, at least that we have to share tonight. But yeah, we'll plan to kind of stick around for the next little while and answer any other questions that come up. We appreciate this conversation. This definitely been our best, if I can say that, out of our neighborhoods that we've met with thus far, just in terms of questions and participation, and very valuable for us. So we appreciate it.
I'm hesitant to answer the question up there now because my dog is barking. But so we'll see how it goes. I'll see. There you go. I'll start, but let me kind of get it started. So here's a question or a comment, really, but I was going to respond to it. That says, I like Berlinda's idea about certain types of looks and designs. And so we've talked, so there's a couple of things here. Nathan is working with the Renaissance neighborhood on a neighborhood character overlay, which that's really the focus of that. But again, kind of back to, was it Berlinda's? Yeah, I guess Berlinda's question about, if there's going to be any design guidelines or style guidelines, or however she asked that, as part of this. And if a specific neighborhood wanted that, I mean, that's something that we could kind of understand better and talk with them about and see how we can incorporate it. I know one neighborhood wanted, I think it might have been Riverview, maybe, even talked about, wanted like the idea, which we haven't had time to really even process much of this because we've had these meetings night after night after night, but having sort of like missing middle, those types of housing would be contingent on meeting certain guidelines or something in their neighborhood. So, I mean, all of those things are definitely options that we can look at. We just need to better understand what the desire was there. Okay, so the comment here is Dunbar neighborhood wants it. So that we would just need to better understand what those details are.
What else, group? We missing anything? I'm just trying to think what else we can kind of share with you all. We've been into the details of this now for a number of months. So there's probably lots we're not even thinking about. Bill, definitely not me. Don't reach out to me. I'm just kidding. But probably reaching out to Nathan, since he's the master of, knows a lot about the neighborhood character overlay and just some of those details. Nathan's your man. Is that fair,
Yeah, Bill,
Nathan?
yeah, that's totally fine. If you want to take down my number, my email right there, and just send me an email that says, kind of what your interest is, and I can explain to you what our other efforts are and kind of what those options might be for sure.
Okay, well, unless there's anything else, I think folks are free to go. Contact information is there. Nathan, Susan, and or I, if we're not around, we can kind of plug you in. I'll let Nathan or Susan answer this, but we've got another question about just kind of consistency across all of our different efforts.
So there won't be any sort of committee established as part of this overlay, but in terms of how our local boards and commissions look at things, they would see these just like any other zoning request as it went through that process. And so they would have an opportunity to at least hear what the intent is of these regulations and why we're adopting them. And we would certainly take that same effort to our Board of Adjustment, I think, to explain what these new rules were and how they came about so that they understand that intent as well. As you may know, boards and commissions are made up of volunteer members who are appointed. And so as much as we do strive to make sure we remain consistent, there's always, independent opinions on those boards and commissions that can have thoughts about how things need to or should go. And so while we try to make sure that education is there and that we're continuing to work with those boards and commissions on those things, it's always a possibility that they'll make a decision different from what we maybe have previously stated or said might happen. Berlinda, I just want to, we did receive your comment, and it's a good comment. It's something that I do think we need to be mindful of, and it's something that we do talk about in our office and how those historical contexts have impacted this neighborhood. And our hope is really to partner this effort with things like Cayenne had mentioned earlier that help to build that base and to support that community so that they can take on these different types of things that we're discussing. And we certainly don't want to relive any of the issues that have occurred in the past. We want to make sure what we do with the zoning code is there only to help the community and build a stronger community. So thank you for the comments, and we appreciate you sending that stuff.
Yeah, and I don't have all the details in front of me right now, but the housing study really does a good job of kind of framing some separate recommendations about that specifically, Berlinda, and everyone that might be interested in kind of seeing what those are and how those are maybe separate too, but complementary of the zoning, what we're looking at, reviewing barriers within the zoning code. There's a number of other actions within the housing study that really outline how to tackle that broader issue, recognizing the historical context of this neighborhood specifically and some of the others as well contained within the housing study. So just again, encourage folks to take a look at that and kind of digest a little bit more when you have time. And if you have more questions or thoughts or feedback, just keep sharing and reaching out to us. Great comment. So Bill asking if there are any private partnerships with the zoning discussions, like banks specifically. With the overlay, no. The general discussion of zoning, though, I would say yes, and that was a part of the housing study. Again, not trying to point back to that too much, but during that time, we spent a fair amount visiting with all of the different really financial institutions that play a role in the housing conversation overall. So banks were a part of that, certainly. The lenders were a part of that. A lot of different partners. And that was a part of helping us understand, the complexities of what issues or challenges we may face with housing, I should say specifically, zoning only being a component of that. So yeah, there has been a lot of conversations there. And I think that that has resulted in many of the policies that are really driving the city's affordable housing strategy, as well as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and some of the policies included within the other incentives and tools and things that are in the works. I don't think that everything is, not all issues have been tackled at this point in time as far as that goes, Bill, but I think that we're making good progress and there's probably more to be done from the financial institutions specifically.
Bill, just as we mentioned earlier, we're really only focused on residential uses as a discussion around this overlay right now. But there's certainly efforts in way to try and recognize where those existing buildings might be, and if there's specific projects people had in mind, then we're always willing to work through the zoning process with them. And I think we have on a few of those older commercial buildings within neighborhood. It's certainly not out of the works to be able to do something with that, but it's not going to be considered as part of the overlay.
Seeing more and more folks, I think, kind of leave the session. So unless there's any objections or questions, kind of hold my breath to wait to see if something pops up. I think we'll call it a night and just thank everyone again for being here. If you didn't get to say anything or want to say more or kind of follow up, if we didn't do a good enough job answering your questions, reach out to us. We're available to chat, email or phone. Again, that's all there available to you. Otherwise, everyone have a great night and we'll be in touch soon.